The envelope hit the table like a verdict. No warning, no knock, just a royal courier who placed it down, gave a stiff nod, and walked out before Selim Osei could even process what was happening. He stared at it. Ivory parchment, gold wax seal, the kind of letter people in stories either burned or obeyed. His fingers didn't shake when he picked it up. That was the thing about Selim. He had trained himself to look calm even when every nerve in his body was screaming. He broke the seal with his thumbnail, unfolded the paper, and read. One paragraph. That's all it took. A royal decree of formal marital arrangement. His name, and the name below it, Darien Vale, Alpha King, age 40, ruler of the Valdoran territory, known for cold efficiency and a governing record so clean it made politicians nervous. Selim set the letter down. He sat at the edge of his chair, in the small apartment that smelled like second-hand furniture and Aerys's grape juice, and he breathed. Aerys. That was the only name that mattered right now. He stood, moved to the window, and looked down at the narrow courtyard where his younger brother, 8 years old, loud even in his silence, already wearing mismatched shoes, was drawing chalk circles on the concrete. Selim watched him for a long moment. Then he went to the small cabinet above the stove, opened it, and pulled out the folder he kept rubber-banded and tucked behind the cooking oil. Medical invoices, sponsorship renewal forms. The letter from Aerys' specialist that had come 3 weeks ago, stamped pending in red ink that didn't care how hard Selim worked or how many side jobs he stacked between his shifts. Hi viewers. If you found out your little brother's medical care depended entirely on a decision you had to make alone, what would you do? Drop your answer in the comments, I want to know. He spread everything on the table. The numbers didn't change no matter how many times he looked at them. Aerys needed the next round of treatment. The sponsorship renewal had been denied once already, and the only organization that had approved a conditional reinstatement was tied, quietly, legally, to the Valdoran Royal Fund, which was controlled by Darien Vale. Selim didn't move for a long time. Then he pulled out a pen, uncapped it, and signed his name at the bottom of the decree. His handwriting was steady. It always was. Not because he wasn't afraid, because fear for Selim had long since learned to sit down and stay quiet. He folded the paper, slid it back into the envelope, and set it by the door. Then he went downstairs to watch Aerys finish his chalk circles. He didn't tell him. Not yet. Aerys was 8, and 8-year-olds deserved to finish what they were drawing. 3 days passed. Routine carried Selim through them. Morning shift at the textile archive. Afternoon errands. Evening with Aerys, dinner, homework, the small rituals that had kept them both functional since their mother stopped coming home. Selim communicated the way he always had. Handwritten notes, expressive gestures, the kind of eye contact that said more than most people managed with full sentences. He hadn't spoken aloud in 4 years. Not because he couldn't, because somewhere between one loss and the next, the words had just stopped feeling safe. His voice had gone somewhere quiet and decided to stay there. Doctors had a name for it. Selim had a different name, he called it honest. On the 4th morning, a second letter arrived. Shorter this time, just a time and an address. He left Aerys with their neighbor, Mrs. Tremblay, packed one bag, and took the long bus route to the Palace District. He told himself he was ready. He told himself this was just paperwork given a grander setting. But when the bus turned the last corner and the palace gates came into view, iron and stone and old money built into every brick, Selim's chest tightened. He stepped off the bus. He walked toward the gate and stopped, because standing just inside the entrance, no court officials, no attendants, no press, no ceremony, was a single figure, tall, dark coat, arms at his sides, watching. Darien Vale was alone. No announcement, no spectacle, just a man standing at his own gate, waiting, as if he had cleared his entire schedule for this one moment and considered it worthwhile. Selim's feet stopped moving. The wind moved between them, and then Darian did something no one had warned him about. Something no rumor had mentioned, no reputation had prepared him for. He raised one hand, and he signed. Cleanly, clearly, with the kind of precision that takes months to learn. Welcome. The word hung in the air like a door swinging open. Selim didn't move. He didn't breathe. Because the contract he had signed, he'd read every clause 3 times, had mentioned educational protections for Aerys, healthcare guarantees, quarterly sponsorship renewals, and a non-coercion clause Selim had assumed was standard royal language. It wasn't standard. He had checked. Darian Vale had personally rewritten those sections, added them, by hand, before the decree was ever sent. The wind picked up. Selim stood at the gate, bag in hand, chest full of something he didn't have a word for yet, and Darian Vale waited, like a man who had already decided that patience was the only currency worth spending. The room was bigger than Selim's entire apartment. He stood just inside the doorway, bag still in his hand, and took it in the way he took in everything new. Carefully, starting from the edges, working toward the center. Stone walls, high ceiling, a window that faced the cliffs and let in too much open sky. A bed with 4 posts and linen the color of first light. Too much space. He felt it the way he always felt large rooms, like the air itself was watching him. A palace attendant had walked him here, given a brief tour in the hallway, and left quietly. No fuss, no lingering, as if they had been told not to. Selim set his bag on the floor near the window. He sat on the edge of the bed and pressed his hands to his knees and told his body to settle down. Didn't. The door opened. He stood fast, faster than he meant to, and Darian Vale stepped in carrying a tray. Simple. A ceramic pot. 1 cup. Steam rising from both. He set it on the bedside table without a word. Then he looked at Selim, and something crossed his face. Not apology, not performance, just acknowledgement. He signed, Jasmine. I was told it helps with tension. Selim stared at him. Darian waited, unhurried, the way a person waits when they're not trying to fill silence. Then he added, signed again, slower. You may lock the door if you wish. I'll be in the study. He turned to leave. Selim's hand moved before his mind caught up. He signed a single word, wait, and immediately regretted it, because now Darian was looking at him and waiting, just like he said he would. Selim swallowed. Signed. You already knew sign language. Darian didn't hesitate. Yes. Signed it back. Clean. No accent. No fumbling. When? Selim signed. Darian's jaw shifted slightly. He looked at the window, then back. Years ago. Before this was arranged. That didn't make sense. Selim's brow tightened. He signed, why? A pause. Darian looked at him directly. His face was difficult to read, not cold, exactly. More like a man who had learned to keep his expressions useful rather than decorative. He signed, because I knew one day I would meet someone worth talking to. Silence. Not the uncomfortable kind. The other kind. The kind that fills up slowly with something neither person has a word for yet. Selim sat back down on the edge of the bed. His hands rested in his lap. Darian moved to leave a second time. Then he stopped at the door, turned, and signed one sentence with steady hands and steady eyes. You were never a debt. He left. The door clicked shut. Selim looked at the tea. The steam curled up and disappeared. He didn't lock the door. He sat there for a long time, replaying those 5 words, looking for the angle, the catch, the condition underneath them. He was practiced at finding those. Life had made sure of that. He found nothing. Just the words. Clean. No decoration. He reached for the tea. It was the right temperature. That bothered him more than if it had been too hot. Too hot was careless. The right temperature meant someone had planned for the time it would take him to sit down. He drank it slowly. When he finally pulled back the covers and lay down, still dressed, shoes off. He stared at the ceiling and listened. The palace settled around him. Pipes, wind, the distant sound of the sea. And from down the hall, faint but clear, the creak of a couch in the study. Selim went still. He knew that sound. He recognized what it meant. Because his old couch made the same noise whenever a person shifted their weight and tried to get comfortable in a place that wasn't a bed. Darian had gone to sleep on the couch. In his own home. In his own palace. He had given Selim the room, the real room, the whole room, and gone to sleep somewhere smaller. Selim pressed one hand flat to his chest. His heart was doing something strange. Not fear. He knew fear. He knew its texture, its timing, the way it sat behind the sternum and pulled tight. This was different. He didn't have a name for it yet. But in the morning he thought just maybe he might let himself look for one. Aerys arrived on a Tuesday with 2 backpacks, a stuffed alligator with one eye, and a list of questions he had written on the back of a cereal box. He walked through the palace entrance like he was conducting an inspection. He looked at the columns, looked at the floors, looked up at the ceiling so long he nearly walked into a vase. Then he looked at Darian. Darian looked back. Aerys crossed his arms. "You're big," Aerys said. "I've been told," Darian replied. "Do you have a sword?" "Several. Can I see them?" "No." Aerys narrowed his eyes. "Why not?" "Because you'd try to use one." Aerys didn't argue, because that was exactly what he'd planned. He uncrossed his arms and went back to looking at the ceiling. Selim stood behind his brother, watching this exchange with the cautious attention of someone waiting for something to go wrong. Darian said nothing more. He didn't try to win Aerys over. Didn't bend down and do the big voice thing adults did when they wanted kids to like them. He just walked toward the east corridor and said, over his shoulder, "I have maps." Aerys looked at Selim. Selim signed, "Up to you." Aerys grabbed his stuffed alligator and followed. The office was large and cluttered with a precision that made no sense from the outside. Stacks of documents in exactly the right disorder. Charts pinned at eye level, trade ledgers stacked by region. A long work table held a map so wide it ran over both edges. Aerys pressed both hands to the table and leaned over it. "What's this part?" He pointed to the western coast. "Shipping channels," Darian said. 42 ports. Each one moves cargo that feeds about 8 territories. "That's a lot." "It is. What happens if one breaks?" Darian considered this seriously, the way he considered most things. "It slows the chain, like pulling a thread from a sweater." Aerys chewed his lip. "Then why don't you just fix all of them at once?" "Resource constraints. You fix the weakest one first, then the next." Aerys pointed to a port on the southern edge. "This one looks sad." "Port Kenna." "You're not wrong." Aerys leaned closer. He spent the next 40 minutes asking questions that had no child-sized answers, and Darian answered every single one with the same tone he used for adults. Straight, no dumbing down, no impatience. Selim sat in the chair by the window and watched. He had expected Darian to get tired of it, to offer Aerys a snack and a redirect, to do the thing people did when children ask too much. Darian never redirected. He just kept talking about Port Kenna and ocean currents and what the tides did in the winter months, and his voice was low and even, and after a while it had the rhythm of something being read aloud. Aerys lasted exactly until the story of the harbor seals that had colonized an abandoned dock in the northern inlet. Then his eyes went heavy. Then they closed. He didn't fall on the floor. He listed sideways, slowly, in that way that only children fall asleep, completely without negotiation, and came to rest with his head on Darian's thigh. Darian stopped talking. He looked down. His hand hovered for a moment, uncertain, like he wasn't sure what the right move was. Then, carefully, he adjusted Aerys so the boy's neck wasn't bent at a wrong angle. Just that. Nothing more. From across the room, Selim saw it happen. And something in his chest moved. Not a lurch. Not a dramatic shift. Something quieter than that, like a door opening a crack. Just enough to let a sliver of something warm come through. He had spent 4 years keeping himself at the edge of every room, in every situation, small enough not to be noticed and therefore not to be targeted. He had learned to read exits before he read faces. He had learned to be the one who noticed things before things noticed him. He had gotten very good at that. But watching Darian Vale sit completely still so an 8-year-old boy could sleep undisturbed, he wasn't afraid. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he wasn't afraid. He leaned his head back against the chair. And then, quietly, so quietly it barely counted, Selim let himself breathe. But when Aerys woke up an hour later, rubbing his eyes and looking at Darian with that measuring look he had, the one that meant he had made a decision, he said with full seriousness. "You're like a bear, a king bear." Darian looked at him. "I find that offensive." "It's a compliment," Aerys said firmly. "It doesn't sound like one." "It is," Aerys said. "Bears protect things." Darian was quiet. Selim, from across the room, watched his husband's jaw tighten just slightly, the way a person's jaw does when something gets past the wall before they're ready for it. He filed that away. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon, without warning. Selim was standing in the administrative corridor, 2 folders tucked under his arm, waiting for the palace secretary to finish with another appointment. He had been up since 5. He had answered 17 internal memos, all signed, all in his careful hand, and had reorganized the Omega labor report that had been sitting incomplete for 6 weeks, because apparently no one else had been going to do it. He had not eaten since morning. He had not sat down since morning. He did not notice any of this until the floor tilted. Not dramatically, just a slow, wrong lean. Like the world had shifted its weight from one foot to the other and forgot to tell him. He reached for the wall. Missed. He was on the floor before he understood he was falling. When he opened his eyes, the palace physician was crouched beside him, and a ceiling he didn't recognize was above him. Medical wing, wide and white and too bright. He tried to sit up. A hand pressed gently to his shoulder, not holding him down, just present. "Slowly," said the physician. Selim looked to his right. Darian was sitting in a chair pulled close to the bed. Not hovering, just there. Coat off, collar loosened. The look on his face was the same one Selim was starting to recognize, the one where he kept most of it back and let just enough through to be honest. The physician, a calm woman named Dr. Aerys, spoke without preamble. "You're not ill in the traditional sense. Your body is depleted. This is what happens when an omega suppresses emotional processing for an extended period. It accumulates physically. Stress hormones, cortisol imbalance, interrupted cycles." She paused. "How long have you been managing alone?" Selim looked at her, then at the ceiling. He held up 4 fingers. She nodded like she'd expected that number or higher. "You need rest. Real rest. 3 days minimum. And you need to stop treating your own needs as optional." She left them the room. Darian didn't fill the silence. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped and said nothing, which Selim had learned was not indifference. It was the way Darian waited, like he believed that silence had its own kind of content and he didn't want to talk over it. Night came. Selim drifted in and out. The room was quiet. The lights had been turned low. At some point someone had left water on the table beside him, and a blanket had been adjusted without waking him, and none of that was Dr. Aerys because her shift had ended. He lay still and breathed. Sometime after midnight, he could tell by the way the light through the window had gone completely dark. He heard Darian shift in the chair. And then, barely above a whisper, not performed, not shaped for anyone's benefit, Darian spoke into the quiet room. "I've run 3 territories in 12 years. I've made decisions that moved markets and settled disputes that would have gone to war." A pause. "And I have never once." He stopped, started again, quieter. I have never once been more careful about anything than I have been about this. Silence. Then, I would undo the world before I undo him. Selim kept his eyes closed. He kept his breathing even. He lay completely still, as if moving might break the honesty of the moment. Might remind Darian that the room wasn't empty and make him pull it back. He didn't want him to pull it back. He lay there, in the dark, with those words settling into him like warmth into cold stone. Slow. Real. He had spent 4 years waiting for the other shoe to drop. Waiting for the moment when gentleness would reveal itself to be strategy. When kindness would show its voice. He was still waiting. And the waiting itself was starting to feel like an answer. In the morning, Darian was still in the chair. He had not left. Selim watched him for a long time before he let himself be seen watching. The offer came on a gray morning, 11 days after the medical wing. Selim was at the long window in the library, a book open in his lap that he hadn't been reading, when Darian walked in and sat across from him. Not beside him. Across, which meant something because Darian was precise about space and what it communicated. He put a document on the low table between them. Selim looked at it, then at Darian. Annulment, Darian said. Clean. No public hearing. No record of cause. He didn't look away. Aerys's medical sponsorship remains active regardless. I had that separated from this arrangement 3 weeks ago. It no longer depends on us. The room was very quiet. I'm not asking you to leave, Darian continued, and I'm not asking you to stay. I'm telling you that you have the choice, an actual one, not a choice with conditions attached to it. Selim looked at the document. He didn't reach for it. Publicly, Darian said. This would be read as weakness on my part. The council has already circulated a memo questioning my decisions since the arrangement. Offering an annulment gives them the narrative they want. He said this evenly, like someone reporting weather. I don't particularly care, he added. Selim looked up. Darian met his eyes and said the thing plainly, with the same precision he applied to everything. If you stay, it must be because you choose it. Not because you owe something. Not because the exit is invisible. Because you want to be here. Silence settled between them. Selim felt it move through him, the weight of that offer. Not a light thing. A heavy, real thing. The kind of gift that costs something. He thought about the first night and the tea at the right temperature. He thought about sign language learned in secret. He thought about Aerys, asleep on the lap of a man who hadn't moved for an hour so as not to wake him. He thought about a whispered sentence in a dark room, never meant to be heard. You were never a debt. He reached across the table. Not for the document. He pulled a single sheet of paper from beneath the book in his lap, picked up the pen on the table, and wrote one word. He pushed it across to Darian. Darian looked at it. Stay. Just that. One word. In Selim's careful handwriting, no decoration, no qualifier. The same hand that had signed away 4 years of survival, that had written 100 notes in the margins of a life built on getting through. This time it meant something different. Not obligation. Not survival. Belonging. Darian sat still for a long moment. Something moved in his face, careful and private and real. He folded the paper once, without looking away from Selim, and placed it in the inside pocket of his coat, like it was something worth keeping. They sat in the library while the gray morning stretched around them, and neither of them moved to leave, and neither of them needed to. But 2 floors down, behind a door left slightly open, a palace attendant delivered a memo to Darian's private secretary. The council had called an emergency session. Traditionalist voices, louder now, more organized, had formally challenged the arrangement on the grounds that a mute omega was an inadequate representation of the crown. The secretary folded the memo, looked at the door, and went to find out whether to interrupt or wait. And somewhere in the palace, A small boy with mismatched shoes had overheard something he was not supposed to hear. He wasn't crying. He was thinking, and that was far more dangerous. Comment below. Do you think Aerys' plan is going to shake the entire council? Or is Darian already 10 steps ahead? The memo had 12 signatures, 12 council members, 12 names, pressed in official ink, delivered to Darian's desk at 6 in the morning like someone wanted him to read it before he had coffee. He read it, set it down, picked it back up. The language was careful, formal, layered in the kind of phrasing that said everything without saying anything illegal. But the argument underneath was not subtle. A mute Omega could not adequately represent the crown, could not speak at state functions, could not address the public, could not fulfill the communication requirements of a royal consort position. 12 signatures. Darian folded the memo in half. Then he called his administrative secretary, a sharp, unhurried woman named Precia Holtz, and asked her to clear his afternoon. She did not ask why. She had been his secretary for 11 years. She had learned not to ask why when he folded things. The council expected a response. They expected the usual. A meeting, a defense, a counter-argument delivered in the conference room where power had been debated and shuffled around for decades. They did not expect what actually happened. On Thursday morning, 3 days after the memo, Darian restructured the palace communication infrastructure. No announcement, no press release, just a new hire list. 12 sign language interpreters, brought on as official palace staff. Salaried, credentialed, given clearance codes and office assignments and the same access badges as any other department. The policy change was filed under Administrative Reform, Section 7, Communication Accessibility Standards. Quiet, efficient, done. Selim found out when Precia handed him a folder over breakfast. He opened it. Read the cover page. Read it again. He looked up at Darian, who was pouring coffee and not looking back, deliberately not looking back in the way that meant he was listening anyway. Selim set the folder down, picked up his pen, wrote, "You didn't tell me you were doing this." Darian turned. "Read it," said simply, "It wasn't about telling you. It was about fixing it." Selim looked at him for a long moment, then wrote, "The council won't let this sit." "I know," Darian said. "They'll escalate. I expect so." He said it the way someone says the weather is going to be cold. Not alarmed, not dismissive, just accurate. Selim turned back to the folder. Page 3 listed the department budget reallocations. The interpreters weren't a pilot program. They weren't temporary. They were a permanent line item, woven into the palace structure the way plumbing was woven into walls. Removing them later would require tearing something apart. That was intentional. Selim knew it. He recognized the architecture of what Darian had done, not just the result but the method. Make the change so structural that reversing it costs more than accepting it. He had used the same logic on the Omega labor reports he'd been quietly rebuilding for weeks. He looked at the page for a long time. Then he wrote one more thing and slid it across the table. "I've been working on something too." Darian sat down. Selim pushed a second folder over. One that had been sitting in his bag for 4 days, waiting for the right moment. Darian opened it. He read slowly. His expression shifted, not dramatically, just a calibration. The look of someone who has revised their understanding of a room they thought they already knew. He looked up. Selim signed, "Omega Labor Structures. Redesigned. If you approve the distribution model, it goes to 3 territories by spring." Pause. "You've been doing this the whole time," Darian said. Not a question. Selim tilted his head. Signed, "Someone had to." The internal memo questioning Darian's judgment had already reached 6 department heads. What no one knew yet, what was still moving quietly through the palace like a slow tide, was that Aerys, age 8, had been listening at the wrong door at the right time. He'd heard 2 words clearly before the voices dropped. "Mute." Useless. He didn't run. He didn't freeze. He went to find paper. The council chamber had high ceilings and bad acoustics and the kind of heavy furniture that was meant to make everyone inside feel the weight of consequence. It was working. 7 members sat at the table when Darian opened the session. The air was already thick with the specific tension of people who had decided what they were going to say before they sat down. Councilman Bertrand Okafor, senior member, white-haired, precise in his contempt, led the opening remarks. He outlined, in formal and careful language, the documented concerns regarding consort representation, communication capacity, public perception, the Crown's image. He was thorough. He was almost done. The door opened, not dramatically, not with a bang or a sweep, just opened. The way doors open when someone small pushes them with both hands. Aerys walked in. He was wearing his school uniform. One sock was slightly higher than the other. He carried a cardboard tube in one hand and a rolled set of papers under his arm, and he walked toward the council table with the particular confidence of a child who has not yet learned to be afraid of rooms like this. Darian looked at him. He should have called security. That was protocol. Unauthorized entry during a formal session was a procedural violation by any standard. He did not call security. He sat back slightly in his chair. Aerys stopped at the end of the table, looked at Councilman Okafor and said, "I have a presentation." Okafor blinked. "This session is not open to." "It's about my brother," Aerys said. "And numbers. I like numbers." He unrolled the papers onto the table. They were hand-drawn charts, done in colored pencil, precise where it mattered, slightly smudged where small hands had worked fast. Each one tracked a different metric: labor efficiency, Omega district output, wage distribution, medical claim rates, and each one showed a clear directional change. Consistent, documented. Across the top of every page, in large careful letters, was a single label. Selim Ose, consort, month 5. Aerys pointed to the first chart. This one shows the Southern District Omega labor output. It went up 17% since my brother redesigned the allocation model. He pointed to the second. This one is the medical cost reduction in the same region. Down 22%. He moved to the third. And this is wage distribution efficiency. It improved every single month. The room was very quiet. Aerys continued. He explained each chart with the calm authority of someone who has practiced this alone in a room and gotten it right. He used words like restructure and margin and distribution curve. Not perfectly, not always in exact context, but close enough that the meaning was clear and the source was obvious. He had learned them from Selim's notes. Councilman Okafor said, slowly, "Where did you get these figures?" "My brother's desk," Aerys said. "He keeps everything organized." He didn't know I was copying them. Sorry. He didn't sound particularly sorry. "These are internal documents," another council member said. "Yes," Aerys agreed. "But they're accurate." No one argued that. Because they were. The numbers were real. The improvements were documented. And they had been executed quietly over the past 5 months. By a 20-year-old who never spoke aloud in meetings and never claimed credit for any of it. Darian looked at the charts for a long time. Then he looked at the council. "The floor," he said quietly, "remains open for objection." No one spoke. What happened next was procedural and therefore not dramatic. But it mattered. The council vote on the formal challenge was called. 7 members. 4 voted to withdraw the challenge. 3 voted to maintain it. The challenge fell. 1 vote. 1 vote. After the session, in the corridor outside the chamber, Aerys found Selim waiting. Because of course Selim had known something was happening. He always knew. He'd been standing outside for 40 minutes, hands in his coat pockets, face unreadable. Aerys walked out and looked up at him. Selim looked down. He signed, slowly. "What did you do?" Aerys shrugged. "Math." Selim stared at him for a full 5 seconds. Then he pulled his brother into a hug. Firm, tight, the kind that didn't have an easy ending. And Aerys held on and said nothing, because sometimes there was nothing to add. From the chamber doorway, Darian watched them. He didn't come closer. He didn't need to. He turned back inside, and quietly, behind the closed door of the council chamber, he let himself feel the weight of what had just shifted, and what it meant for everything still ahead. The chapel had no audience. That was Selim's only request. He had written it on a slip of paper 3 weeks before, slid it under Darian's office door in the early morning before anyone else was moving, and waited. He hadn't signed it. He hadn't included any context. Just no audience. That's all. The reply came the same evening, slid back under his door. Agreed. Tell me when. So it was small. The way Selim preferred things. Stone walls, old candles, a window that faced east. The kind of chapel that had been used for private family ceremonies for generations. Not built for display, built for meaning. Darian stood at the front in a dark coat. No decorations, no formal regalia. His hands were at his sides. He watched Selim walk in and said nothing while he got there, because he was good at giving space without withdrawing. The officiant, a quiet older man named Reverend Elias Drummond, stood between them. The ceremony was short, intentionally. Reverend Drummond spoke simply, without extra ceremony. He named what was happening, a bonding, a formal union, a mutual choice made in the presence of witnesses, which in this case was only him, Aerys, and a single palace attendant who had been asked to stay as the official record keeper. When it came to consent, Drummond turned to Darian first. Do you enter this bond willingly, without condition, and with the full understanding of what it means? Yes, Darian said. Then Drummond turned to Selim. He signed the question for him because someone had arranged that in advance, and that someone had not mentioned doing it. Selim looked at the officiant, then at Darian. His hands lifted. He signed, yes. Then he did something else. He opened his mouth. His throat worked. Just once. The sound that came out was barely there, thin as paper, rough at the edges, shaped more by effort than by air, but it was a word. Stay. The room went still. Aerys, seated in the small pew to the left, looked at his brother with wide eyes and did not speak, which for Aerys was extraordinary. Darian did not react the way people react in stories. No dramatic step forward, no overwhelmed expression. He just held very still, the way a person holds still when they're trying to protect something fragile. Then he exhaled slowly, and nodded once. Reverend Drummond completed the ceremony. The bond formed the way bonds do when they're built on the right foundation. Not in a flash, not violently, not with the sharp snap that people sometimes feared. Settled. Warm and steady, like pressure equalizing in a sealed room. Selim waited for the panic. The tightening. The old reflex that had always followed closeness, the one that said too much, too exposed, get smaller. It didn't come. He stood in the small chapel with the east-facing window and the old candles, and his chest was open and still, and the thing he felt was not fear. It was quiet. Real quiet. The kind that had nothing hiding inside it. After the ceremony, Aerys took Selim's hand on one side and Darian's on the other, completely uninvited, completely certain, and walked them both back toward the main hall. No one said anything for a while. Then Aerys looked up at Darian and said, "Does this mean you're officially a king bear now?" Darian looked down at him. "That name," he said, "is retired." "It's not," Aerys said cheerfully. It wasn't. Morning came in sideways through the kitchen window and landed on the floor in long gold pieces. Aerys was already at the table. He had gotten there before anyone else, which meant he had also gotten into the bread before anyone else, and there were now crumbs across 3 place settings and an extremely innocent expression on his face that did not hold up to any scrutiny. Darian was at the stove. He was wearing an apron. This was important because the apron said Best Chef across the front in large letters, and it had clearly been chosen by Aerys, and Darian wore it with the exact expression of a man who had weighed his dignity against an 8-year-old's joy and made his peace with the outcome. He was also failing to make eggs. Not catastrophically. But the eggs were not cooperating, and every time he adjusted the heat, something else went wrong in a different direction, and Aerys was watching with the gleeful attention of a person who does not cook but has very strong opinions. "You're stirring too much," Aerys said. "I'm aware," Darian said. "My brother never stirs them. Your brother is better at this than I am." "At everything," Aerys said, nodding seriously. Selim stood in the doorway. He had come down quietly, as he did most things, and stood watching the two of them in the morning light. The apron, the crumbs, the eggs that were getting away from the most competent man he had ever met. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth. He was smiling. He hadn't noticed it happening. He walked in, gently moved Darian to the side, one hand on his arm, light and direct, and took over at the stove. No drama. No commentary. He just picked up where things had gone wrong and made them go right, and within 3 minutes the eggs were exactly what they were supposed to be. Darian stood beside him, arms crossed, watching, then said very quietly, "You're insufferably good at everything." Selim signed, "I know." Aerys cackled from across the table. They ate breakfast at the wide kitchen table with the gold morning light across it, and the conversation was mostly Aerys explaining something he had read about deep-sea fish, and Darian asking precise follow-up questions about bioluminescence, and Selim eating and listening and occasionally signing a comment that Aerys translated aloud before Darian could finish reading it himself. Normal. Oddly, quietly normal. After breakfast, while Aerys took his dishes to the sink. Mostly. Selim stood at the kitchen window with his tea. He looked out at the cliffs. At the water below, moving the way it always moved. Indifferent. Constant. He thought about the boy he had been 2 years ago, sitting at a small table, reading a royal decree, not shaking. He thought about what he had expected to find behind those palace gates. Not this. Not tea at the right temperature. Not sign language learned before the wedding. Not a man who wore a ridiculous apron and lost to eggs. He set his cup down, and felt it quietly without announcement, the nausea. It had come before, 3 times in the last week. Not sharp, just present. Low and certain, arriving in the mornings and dissolving by noon. He frowned at the window, pressed one hand flat to his stomach. Later that afternoon, Dr. Rainus confirmed it in the same no-nonsense tone she used for everything. "You're pregnant," she said. "Early. 8 weeks." She handed him a folder with information, scheduled a follow-up. Talked through the first trimester. Selim sat on the exam table and held the folder and didn't move. He heard the door open behind him. He hadn't called Darian. He hadn't told anyone. But Darian was there, because Dr. Rainus had called him, apparently, which she had decided to do without asking, and Selim was going to have a conversation with her about that later. He turned. Darian stood in the doorway. He had clearly come fast, coat not fully on, one button undone. He looked at Selim, then at the folder, then back at Selim. He understood immediately. And then something happened that Selim had never seen before and would never fully be able to describe later. The most contained man he had ever met, the man who had governed 3 territories and made hard decisions without flinching, the man who had never once performed his emotions for an audience, put one hand over his eyes, and cried, quietly, with his whole chest. The way people cry when a weight they didn't know they were carrying finally sets itself down. Selim slid off the table. He crossed the room. He put both arms around Darian and held on, and Darian let him, and they stood in the small medical office with the afternoon light coming sideways through the blinds, and neither of them needed words. They had enough of everything now. For years past, not in a flash, not the way stories sometimes skip over time like it's a detail, slowly, in the way real things grow. Gradually, with seasons, with setbacks folded into the progress so smoothly you couldn't always tell which was which. Aerys was 12 now. He was taller, still loud, and had been formally acknowledged as crown heir 6 months ago in a ceremony he had complained about the seating arrangements for but had otherwise handled with surprising composure. He had opinions about everything: policy, trade logistics, the correct way to organize a reference library, and had started sitting in on junior council briefings, where he asked questions that made senior advisors clear their throats and reach for their notes. Luna was 3. She was small and extremely certain of herself and had learned to walk by following Aerys around, which meant she walked with her chin up and her hands clasped behind her back like she was inspecting something. She called Darian Day and Selim Papa, and had strong feelings about the color orange that no one fully understood but everyone respected. The palace looked different now. Not in its bones, the stone was the same, the corridors were the same. But there were new things in it. A dedicated communication office, fully staffed, that had become a model for 3 other territories. An Omega economic development program that had gone from Selim's hand-drawn revision notes to a standing policy affecting nearly 200,000 people. An accessibility restructuring that had been quietly cited in 4 regional governance reviews as best practice. Selim had never given a speech. He had never needed to. The work spoke clearly enough on its own. That was the morning's rhythm now, measured, full, belonging to all of them. Darian handled the governance architecture. Selim handled the ground-level policy restructuring in writing in detail in the language of people who had been overlooked and needed systems that actually fit them. Aerys had started drafting his own proposals, rough, ambitious, occasionally impractical, always earnest. And Luna brought drawings to every meeting she was allowed in, which was not all of them but more than was strictly official. On a Tuesday in October, Selim woke before the sun. He lay still for a moment. Let the quiet settle. Then he got up and went to the window that faced the cliffs. The sea was dark below. The sky was just starting to change, that slow, early shift from black to the color that doesn't have a name yet. He heard footsteps. Darian appeared beside him. He didn't say anything, just stood there with 2 cups of coffee, handed one over, and looked at the same view. They stood in the quiet for a while. Then from down the hall, a door, small feet, and the particular sound of a 3-year-old who has decided the day is starting whether anyone else is ready. Luna appeared in the doorway, hair everywhere, blanket trailing, completely awake and extremely purposeful. Duh, she said, looking at Darian. Outside. It's early, Darian said. Outside, she said again, firmly. Aerys appeared behind her, already dressed, which meant he had been up for a while. He looked at both of them. She's been saying that for 20 minutes. We should probably just go. Darian looked at Selim. Selim signed. She's right. They went outside. The cliffs in October were cold. The wind came in off the water and moved through everything and smelled like salt and distance. Luna held Darian's hand on one side and Aerys's on the other and walked the path like she owned it, which in most practical senses she did. Selim walked a few steps behind. He watched Darian lift Luna onto his arm when the path got uneven. Watched Aerys point out something in the water, a bird maybe, or a shift in the current, and Darian follow his gesture and respond, and the two of them leaned slightly toward each other the way people do when they're both looking at the same thing and finding the same interest in it. He stopped. He stood on the cliff path in the early October wind and he watched his family. That word. He had used it once, quietly, in a letter he had written to no one, just to see how it looked. He had folded it up and put it away. Too large. Too early. It wasn't too large anymore. He thought about the boy who had signed a decree alone at a small table and not shaken, who had packed one bag and walked toward a gate and found a man standing at it who already knew how to say welcome in his language. He thought about the 4 years between that moment and this one. All the small things. All of them adding up. Darian turned and looked back at him, the way he looked when he was checking quietly without drawing attention to the checking. The small confirmation that said, still here, still good. Selim signed across the distance, one hand, still here. Darian held his gaze for a moment, then turned back to the children. Luna was already pointing at the water and telling it something. What exactly, no one could be sure, but she was committed to it. She always was. The sun came up, slowly, the way real things do, and on the cliff path above the sea, on an ordinary Tuesday in October, a family stood in the cold morning light. Loud in some places, quiet in others, always worth the choosing, and the world turned around them the way it always had, just with different weight now, lighter, real. The greatest revolution wasn't in any council chamber or policy document or formal decree. It was here, a family that had refused to break and chosen every single day to stay. Thank you so much for watching this story all the way to the end. That means everything. If this moved you, if you saw yourself in Selim's quiet strength, in Aerys's unshakable loyalty, in the kind of love that doesn't demand but just shows up, then this channel was made for you. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. New ones are coming. Stories about chosen family, quiet courage, and the kind of love that doesn't make headlines but changes everything. Drop a comment below. Tell me which moment hit you the hardest. Was it the tea at the right temperature? The sign language? Aerys walking into that council chamber with colored pencil charts and no fear? Your comment might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. Share this story. Someone out there needs to know that gentleness is not weakness. That protection can arrive quietly, and that sometimes the life you never expected is the one that finally fits.